Yeah, I'm gonna do this in English. My German is not so good, so I understand about most of it, but I don't speak it so well. But my name is Susse. I'm an experienced designer on Adobe XD, where I'm focused primarily on voice and audio. And just before I continue, a show of hands in here. Who in here is designers or who don't mind being mistaken for a designer? We got a couple in the back. That's great. So I believe in a lot of what we've seen, that designers are going to be key, and especially creatives are going to be key to unlocking the potential of voice design. It is not until we invite more people into the process of creating these interfaces that we're really going to see the full potential. So today I'll share a little bit about how we think about voice design at Adobe and why we believe creatives are the key to unlocking the potential of this, and also a little bit of how we see building voice prototypes, as Peter mentioned, and a little bit of like how we bring this out to the masses, how we bring this to more people. I am we joke a little bit around being a pixel pusher turned voice designer. Pixel pushing, that's what most UX and UI designers do today. To be honest, most of my day is still doing this. My background is in product design, and in 2015 I started on my first voice design for a company called Bose. We sort of embarked on developing a voice strategy, and we believed, I was in a team of 5 other designers, and we believed our background in usability design would help us sort of define what voice design was. And that was the same year that Alexa had just entered the market, and a thing we were joking around was, ooh, maybe we're just making Alexa, and it was sort of hard to wrap our heads around. Are we making an assistant? What is voice? What is it? And how are we going to approach this? And I think what we've seen with smart speakers and sort of the magic in this, and also what we've heard both yesterday and today that's so magical, is that when you take this rigid structure of a conversation and you break it into inputs and outputs, we sort of reach to a whole new level, and we reach our users in a whole new level. And it's something, as a designer, I was super excited about. Sort of thinking about all the use cases where my screen-based interfaces fall flat, and then being able to accommodate that with a voice interface. So any scenario where my users have their hands busy or their eyes busy, sort of in surgery, or when you're driving a car, that's moments where a voice-based interface might be a better option. And it's sort of, as you're designing an experience from beginning to end and having these options available, you start to build user experiences that serve your users in a whole new way. So I was really excited about it, and I was fully bought into it when I started working on my first voice project, but I also felt the pain of not having tools to develop this and not having tools to prototype with this, which was one of the reasons why I, 2 years ago, quit my job to join a startup in New York called SaySpring. We were a web-based platform building prototyping tools for voice interfaces. And we managed to stay a startup for just about 9 months before we were acquired by Adobe last year in April. And ever since we were acquired, we've been building out voice functionalities in Adobe XD. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But for me, as a UI designer embarking on voice design, one of the things I sort of had in mind when I started, and what I envisioned out, and what we all were dreaming on our team, was sort of...
So do you know what I'm thinking right now?
Well, I take it from your tone that you're challenging me. Maybe because you're curious how I work? Do you want to know how I work?
Yeah, actually. How do you work?
Well, basically, I have intuition. I mean, the DNA of who I am is based on the millions of personalities of all the programmers who wrote me. But what makes me, me, is my ability to grow through my experiences. So basically, in every moment, I'm evolving. Just like you.
That's really weird.
Is that weird? Do you think I'm weird?
Kind of.
So I had, this is from the movie Her. I don't know if anybody has seen this, but Samantha, the voice assistant, and sort of like dreaming up, like, ooh, we can design technologies that works like Samantha in the movie Her, was aspiring. Reality is like we're a little far from that still. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. But if we look at today, 2019, 4 years after Amazon came out with Alexa, they've sold close to 100 million devices, which is crazy with the amount of speed that they've managed to put those out. Google, on the other hand, is a little over 50,000 at the same. The latest stat I heard was 22% of American adults have a smart speaker. That is an insane number with the speed that this is developing. And also like the fact that it's getting out there, I think it's proving its worth. And it's also the same here in Europe. I don't have the same numbers, unfortunately, on that. But I think also, if we think about what we do with these smart speakers and thinking about where they are, I think we still have a lot of work to do, and I think there's still a lot of opportunities. I have another example here of the reality of some of the use cases that's going through, and full disclosure, this is not my video. I found it on the internet, but I promise you I've seen it 400 times. Oh, did I lose sound? Did I lose sound? Not sure. All right. I might have lost sound in that moment, but it's a very endearing video of an Italian grandma that's interacting with Google, and she calls it Gugu. I'll send it to you afterwards. But so kind of if we take a step back, like the technology is here. We have these opportunities. Natural language processing is at a place where it hasn't been before. But it's very hard to design a good voice experience, even with the technology being here. And one of the things we experienced, I experienced myself when I was working at Bose. We were sitting across engineers that was waiting for us to hand off designs and giving them sort of, this is what we're building. And they were looking at us like, well, we don't know what we're building. So essentially with a voice interface, you're designing what the users say, what the system responds back, and how it would respond back. And it's hard to do, and there aren't a lot of tools to do that. So in October last year, we launched voice features in Adobe XD. Adobe XD is our experience design tool, and one of the reasons we put voice features into a screen-based design tool was because we wanted, if voice is going to be the next phase of experience design, we wanted to put this in the hands of designers. We wanted to make sure that they don't have to design one experience in one tool and then design another part of the experience in another tool, but have this be combined. Let's see here. Oh, sound works now. So as you can see here, I'm going through this. We just treat voice commands the same way we treat tap, the same way we treat drag. So you can assign a voice command between two artboards. You put in a string of words. You can put in as many as you want for this, and you can prototype really quickly what it means to say a phrase and go from one screen to another screen. And then what we have on the screen, other screen, we have, you can add a speech response on your screen when you land on it, set with a time trigger, and then you can have the system talk back. So within just like a few minutes, you can build up a voice prototype. You can put it in front of users, you can put it in front of your stakeholders, or you can send it to your developers, and you can sort of start to build an iterative process the same way you have with your screen-based design. And what we've seen work really well, I think a good point would...
Alexa, open Trip Planet.
Welcome to Trip Planet. You can explore all the corners of the world with us. Try saying "What's up in Berlin?" or "Inspire me."
What's up in Berlin?
Lots of interesting stuff is going on in Berlin this week. Say, "Show experiences in Berlin," or "Find restaurants nearby."
So this was a prototype I had put together in XD. It took me just 15 minutes to put this together really easily, and this is something we use internally with our stakeholders. But I think also what, I think it was Alexander from Google that's mentioned yesterday that how the mobile revolution and sort of like mobile interfaces took off over the past 10 years. I think we need to see the same thing for voice in order for voice really to reach its potential. And we need to build tools that we can put in the hand of designers to really start driving this. So I wanted to show a couple of principles that we've learned from both our users at Sayspring and from Adobe, and some of the ways that we think about voice design. And I think it's really interesting because I've heard some similar things from Katz earlier and yesterday. It's good to see, but also I think as this medium and especially the economy of this medium is evolving, it's constantly moving back and forth. And I think also one of the interesting things for us at Adobe looking at is like, have we got this right? Is this the right way? The assistant model, the interface model, like, is this the right way to doing it? And putting in the hands of more people and having more people form opinions about this really helps drive this in a democratic way. So one of the things we've seen is sort of like, we try to distinguish really hard voice and bots. And the reason we're doing that is because you can't just take a bot interface and then flip it over with audio and then bam, you have a voice interface. And one of the things that's driving this is that reading and listening and speaking and typing are two very cognitively different things. Like, you have to think about when your user is listening, like they're using a whole different attention span when they're listening, as opposed to when you're reading, you go back and forth and you can sort of use this to keep up with. And the same thing when we're speaking, I have so much more that's accompanying my words when I'm speaking as opposed to when I'm typing. So cognitively, these are two different behaviors, but also interaction-wise, these are very different from each other. And one thing that's kind of helped us also think about voice design is think of it as turns. I think it's a very normal thing in voice design right now, is sort of you have one turn or you have many turns. One turn is like this simple handoff that's most voice interfaces today, and I think one turn is great for a lot of things, like what time is it? It's 5:30 p.m. and then you move on to your next thing. It's a little harder designing multi-turn conversations, and this is sort of where you get into sort of the more exciting but also meatier part of it. And I think designers are essential in this process of building these experiences that go multi-turn. And going back to sort of the mobile revolution and some of the things we learned as designers working really well, we sort of have these usability patterns that we lean up against, which are default now but didn't used to be default. Just simple things like introducing a hierarchy and like you have two buttons. The one button you want the user to push the most, you make it visually more present and prominent, and then you put that out there, and then it's super easy for a user to go through the flow. Like, these usability patterns were key to make the mobile revolution move forward, and there's similar things we can do with voice design. So when we have our multi-turn conversations, there are little things we can do to increase the usability of our voice design. So things like, in this example, ask the users to be specific if they ask something. Did you mean? Like, put these little things in, like make sure they're specific in what they're asking. That avoids ambiguity and then gets you faster. Like, fail gracefully, I think was Kat saying. I think that's like really accurately, like, what is it actually the user wants to do? Provide options in case there's a doubt of anything. Provide options as they go through this. Like, which one is it that you're meaning? Is it this one or is it this one? Instead of an open-ended question, what do you mean? What do you want? Another thing is repeat back what the user says. And this is part of like making sure the system understands, but also repeating it back. That gives a reassurance to the user, okay, you actually heard me, and that eliminates some of the frustration that goes into like making, I wouldn't say a bad user experience, but I would say a challenging user experience. And then also keeping it short. I think that's like the one key. What is it, the Mark Twain quote that goes, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long letter. It's really, really hard to keeping these responses short, but it's so essential to making the experience. Like, we can't listen to a response that's 7 options long, like just making it short. And I think this is the point where what we've seen working really well is invite your brand team in, invite your marketing in, invite your copywriters in, have them be part of this process of developing responses that are short and precise. Another thing for most of you that work in voice knows that intent is super important, and I think one thing to think of is your smart speaker, like your Google Home, is not just sitting around and saying like, "Hey, buddy, what's up? What can I help you with? What's going on?" Like you kind of have to like instantiate and have an intent behind. And for designers, it's super important also to set those intents in, like what is it actually we want our users to go through. In the same way with utterances, like the different ways of expressing the same request, that's something that we found super important in the prototyping tools we were building. Because as you sort of like put these things together, and if you're building a skill or an action, you're putting these strings of words, these utterances into your, giving them off to your developers to put into the system. It's really hard to come up with all of these, especially if you have your primary users are seniors, or your primary users are kids, or your primary users have speech impediments, or they're bilingual. If you go through a process where you user test fast and you sort of get to learn what languages that they're using, what utterances would they say, what are the different ways of saying this, you can capture this in the design process before you hand it off to an expensive development process. And also it's key for the designer to be in the aware of what is actually the language that our users are going to be using, and how can we start to be smart about this, because the system will take care of it. But sort of building this into the design process and have creatives use this as part of their toolbox is super important. Words is a big part of designing for voice, and I think when we have these T-shapes designers that sort of have different skill sets, and no designer is the same, but designers especially that has a copywriting background, or designers that are really, really good with Word, do really well in voice design, and are so important to making the experience a lot better. I think one of the things that's also important is this, in this iterative process, is testing out what works and what doesn't work in this. I have an example here of the same response that's sort of like gone through a couple of takes, and what we found with XD is it's fast to iterate through these, but also it's different when you type out a response and you think you've kind of said it, and then when you listen to it and you hear it, it either sounds boring, or it sounds too snarky, or it sounds too funny, or not really the thing that's needed for the experience, where it's so important to listen to your responses fast, and the words play such a big role in this. I'm just going to play this real quick.
Let us find a shampoo for your dry winter hair. It's winter time and the living ain't easy. For our hair, let's get you started with the right shampoo.
So it was for a cosmetic client, and they needed something that was on brand. They needed something that was a little sassier. So in the responses, they could sort of develop that, and it was not living on Alexa, but it was in the words that they put, and in the little puns that was put into it, and that was all part of the design process, and then it was handed off to development. SSML is also a great way to sort of design these and test and iterate through these. And I think also this is one of the things that is really interesting, because it triggers something in all of us, and it makes it just a little more emotive, the experience. Both, I think my favorite part is seeing stakeholders' faces when we sort of put the effort into developing the SSML, but also seeing customers in this. It's borderline creepy, but also interesting. So I have an example of this here.
Let me tell you something real quick. Let me tell you something real quick, you.
So it's super easy to apply SSML, and SSML is markup language, and you don't need to have a developer background to play around with what SSML is. Like you can play around with this as a designer, and I think also as a designer you should have a strong opinion about what this looks like in your experience. The same way Amazon came out with a thing called auto breathing. That's SSML, but for breathing, so you can add different ways of breathing to your design. I'm just going to play these real quick.
Sally, is that you? I am not sure. I think I need to think about it.
Wow, that was quite fast. I almost beat my personal best time on this track.
So it's essentially you're designing breathing into your voice design, which is kind of odd, but it does make an impact on the experience in the end. And there are tools that you can go where you don't need a computer science degree to go in and design these. Another thing, and it was also mentioned yesterday and today, which is like, I think one of the key elements of voice design is a flat UI if it's not accompanied by a screen. And everything happens in sequence. And because of this, things take longer. Like it just takes a little bit more time. Most voice systems allows for you to barge in, which a lot of people don't know, but like barging in is a good thing. Like you can interrupt the system and you can get to what you want faster. But this is also something that we've thought about, like how do we design these experiences where they take a little more time, and also like almost like blindfolded, like putting it in front of users and they can't see, or they can't find their menu, they can't find their GUI, they can't sort of go back, and they can't go back and forth. So I have an example here of a pharma client that was designing prescription for the Google Home, and they took a vector, put it into XD, used our animation to animate the light, and then talk their way through what would be the best use case for filling prescription.
When does my prescription expire?
Your prescription expires in 3 days. Would you like me to renew your insulin prescription?
All right. So again, this is like an example of a voice-only experience, but put together in just half an hour with a vector and a couple of voice commands and speech responses. And I think another thing that's also going back to the T-shaped designer or the T-shaped creative that goes into this, it's rarely just voice. There's so much more that accompany it. With smart speakers, we've seen both sound and light design coming together really nicely and conveying and building the experience, where it becomes almost like an orchestration in that sense. And also, I think one of the best parts of voice design is ear cons. Like icons worked really well on screen-based design. Ear cons works equally well on sound design, and really good designed ear cons are super well in conveying. And going back to how voice design sometimes takes a lot of time to go through, because everything happens in sequence. When you have an error chime or a delete chime or a welcome chime, you can convey a lot to the user in just a few seconds, and that's super powerful. And especially with branding, audio branding will set you ahead as an organization, and it's an interesting way to sort of bring designers into it. Even the designers that used to have a band in college, bring them in and have them craft their music experience. I think it's great to see these worlds coming together. So thinking about sort of the orchestration of all these things coming together, and how do we as designers start to get an impact into all these pieces in the process, where it's not just a screen flow, where it's not just a voice flow, but now it's also the light flow and the hardware. It's sort of all these things happening in sequence. And I think especially like as you're iterating through it, how do you keep track of all these things? And that's something we've been trying really hard to do in XD. And another thing that we saw last year was that both Amazon and Google put out their smart speakers with screens on them. And a piece of me was like, wait, we didn't even figure out how to design for smart speakers. Now you're putting a screen on them. Hold on. But it actually is a super interesting thing from a design perspective, because now you have the handoff of both voice and screen together side by side, and you can create some really interesting stuff. But as a designer, it also means that if we go back to the orchestration, all of a sudden you have to think of screen input, you have to think of voice input, voice output, screen output, and your orchestration all of a sudden becomes a lot more to keep track of as you're going through this. So I have an example here. We've been working close with Amazon as they've been rolling out their screen devices, and they're rolling them out really fast. here's an example of a skill that we put together for the Amazon Alexa show, the second generation. I think that's the newest one it's called. I think the first generation, I don't know if I'm the only one, but the first generation kind of looked like it was ripped out of the back of an airplane seat. I don't know where they got their form factor from, but the second one is a little better, so I'll just show this to you.
Bloom helps you send flowers to your loved ones. Start by saying send flowers, or save you my previous orders.
Send flowers.
What day would you like your flowers to arrive?
Tomorrow.
Oh, cut off. But so super easy to start to think about voice and screen coming together, and tap and voice commands and speech output and screen animations coming together. Here. I also wanted to circle back a little bit in some of the things, like why it is that prototypes are so important for the process of developing these technologies. And I think like Brett Victor has a really good take on this in an essay he called the ladder abstraction. That's kind of when we don't understand a system well enough to predict its behavior, we prototype. There are a lot of worlds that we don't know how they're going to look like. I think the economy of voice is changing so fast, and we're kind of just holding on and moving along as it's developing and as it's moving. We have no idea where it's going. But if we can prototype these what-if worlds, and if we can prototype these experiences, then we get a chance to invite more people into these what-if worlds, and we sort of can think about, like, does this actually make sense? Is this the right way to do it? And I think the most important thing is also inviting people from different backgrounds into these what-if worlds and these what-if processes. Like bias is a big thing, but if we can lower the barrier of entry for people not only to have an opinion about how these are shaped, but also go ahead and build something better, I think that's even more. And I think it's necessary for us to see this developing. And we saw at SaySpring and at Adobe how fast organizations are adapting to having voice be part of their product. And I think we're all believing that it's going to be a big part of digital products moving forward. I think Amazon is pushing very hard for this personality across many devices, where skills make this personality smarter, where Google is pushing a little bit more for an operators model where you build actions. The constructs of these are changing, but we can have people be part of this change. We can invite more people into it. So we joke a little bit about, like, if we must talk to our microwaves, it's better be a good conversation. Adobe XD is free. I'm here for questions all day. Also email me if you have any questions. I'm happy to help. We're constantly evolving our platform and reaching out. Also, it works in German. That's one thing I had to remember to say. It works in German, but yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Susse. I think for me at least it was really very interesting, not only because you showed your perspective. I like very much the sentence you cited. When we don't understand the system well enough to predict its behavior, we prototype. Exactly, that's I think the key, right? And you showed many aspects which we possibly, for many of us, were a discovery, exactly a discovery in this uncharted territory where nobody knows actually exactly how it works. So, any questions for Susse? Or comments? Okay.
You can ask in German.
Back there.
Too.
To the programmer, or how is it going?
Yeah, so prototype it in XD, put it in front of users to user test it,
Okay.
and then we have dev specs that you can send off to developers directly from XD that has the final voice design that you've landed on in your iterative process.
Okay, so you just put the specification into the prototyping and then hand it over.
Yeah,
Okay. And
How do you hand it over?
a link. I just I don't know if I have time, but I can also show afterwards. We have a link that's sent for specs for development. You just send them a link, and then they can get access to your full prototype, and both with screen and with voice design that goes into it.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have an API so I could design an XD and automatically get the specs into my tech stack?
We have a plugin system, so you can develop for plugins for XD, where you could potentially take the voice command and the speech response, and then send that off. I think that would be a great plugin to build and develop. We have a lot of resources for plugins, so I'm happy to share a link with you afterwards.
Cool, thanks.